The scent of salt and centuries struck Elias the moment his boots met the weathered planks of the Galata dock. Before him, Constantinople unfurled like a tapestry woven from gold thread and shadow. A city of impossible scale and intoxicating contradiction. Minarets pierced the low-hanging clouds, their slender forms like needles stitching heaven to earth, while the massive dome of the Hagia Sophia brooded with the weight of reconsecrated gods. The air itself was a living thing, thick with the cries of gulls, the guttural shouts of porters, and the melodic call to prayer that seemed to emanate from the very stones. He had travelled for months, fueled by a scholar's hunger for the heart of the Ottoman Empire, but the reality of it was a physical blow, a stunning panorama of power that both dazzled and daunted. He moved through the chaotic press of the harbour, his European clothes marking him as an outsider. His eyes, accustomed to the orderly grey facades of Paris, drank in the vibrant chaos. Spice merchants sat cross-legged before pyramids of saffron and cumin, their colours a shock against the muted stone. Armoured janissaries moved in tight formations, their tall white hats cutting through the crowd with an air of unassailable authority. Yet, beneath the vibrant surface, Elias sensed a subtle, pervasive tension. It was in the way a merchant's smile faltered as the soldiers passed. In the hurried way, a woman drew her veil and averted her gaze. It was a city, breathing deeply, but holding its breath all the same. A man detached himself from the shadow of a stack of cedarwood crates, his movements fluid and watchful. He was of middling years, with a face etched by the sun and sea, his eyes holding a knowing glint that missed nothing. "You are the French scholar," he stated, his Greek accent colouring the Latin words. "I am Dmitri. I was told to find you." Elias nodded, relief tempering his wariness. Dmitri fell into step beside him, his presence a quiet anchor in the tumult. They began to climb the steep, narrow streets, away from the water. The grandeur of the imperial city giving way to the intimate, claustrophobic reality of its daily life. Washing lines crisscrossed between wooden balconies, and the smell of baking bread and sewage mingled in the close air. As they walked, Dmitri pointed out landmarks with a casual, proprietary air, but his commentary held a darker undercurrent. He spoke of the Grand Bazaar, not just as a market, but as a place where a merchant had recently lost a hand for short-waiting spices. He noted the imposing gate of the Topkapi Palace and mentioned, almost as an afterthought, the efficiency of the Sultan's justice. His words were not threats, merely statements of fact, yet they landed on Elias's mind with the weight of cold iron. "The law here is a swift and final thing," Dmitri said, his gaze fixed on a squadron of palace guards changing shifts. "It does not linger in dusty courtrooms. It acts. A man can wake in the morning a free man, and by noon his head can be separated from his shoulders for a crime he may or may not have committed. The people have learned that curiosity about such matters is a luxury they cannot afford." The words settled in the space between them, chilling the warm afternoon air. Elias looked out over the sprawling city, the golden light of the setting sun now gilding the minarets. The awe he felt was now tinged with a new, sharp emotion, scholar's curiosity grappling with a man's primal dread. He had come to study an empire, to document its laws and customs. But Dmitri's casual revelations hinted that the true nature of Ottoman power was not written in the elegant scripts of its libraries, but in the silent, fearful obedience of its people and the swift, terrible certainty of its punishments. He was standing at the gateway, and the path ahead promised not just knowledge, but a confrontation with a justice far more brutal and absolute than any he had ever imagined. The spectacle unfolded in a sun-drenched square not far from the towering edifice of the Suleimani Mosque, a place where justice was not debated but displayed. Elias had been drawn by the sound, a low, gathering rumble of a crowd that was part anticipation, part bloodlust. He and Dmitri found a place at the edge of the throng, a sea of turbans and fezzes, all facing a raised wooden platform. Upon it stood 3 figures, a man on his knees, his hands bound behind his back, a stern-faced official holding a scroll, and a massive, impassive man clad in black, a long, curved scimitar resting on his shoulder, its polished steel catching the morning sun with a cruel, blinding wink. The official's voice boomed across the square, reciting the charges in Turkish. Dmitri leaned close, his translation a soft, grim whisper in Ilyas's ear. The kneeling man was a thief. He had stolen a purse of silver from a merchant. The evidence was incontrovertible. The sentence prescribed. The crowd stirred, a collective intake of breath that was not of shock, but of satisfaction. This was not a tragedy. It was a ritual. The executioner stepped forward. His movements were not rushed or angry, but practiced, economical. He positioned himself behind the condemned man, his boots steady on the planks. There was no speech from the thief, no last words, only a bowed head and the visible tremor that ran through his shoulders. The crowd fell silent, the anticipation thickening the air like honey. Elias's own heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, terrified drumbeat against the stillness. He wanted to look away, but a morbid, scholarly fascination rooted him to the spot. His mind already trying to categorize the moment, to file it away as an anthropological observation. The scimitar rose in a high, fluid arc, a silver crescent against the brilliant blue sky. For a split second it seemed to hang there, a perfect, terrible sculpture. Then it fell. The sound was not the clean chop of wood, but something wetter, denser, a sickening thud that was both soft and final. The head dropped forward, tumbling into a waiting basket with a dull, hollow sound, while the body, in a macabre pantomime of life, slumped sideways, a fountain of crimson erupting from the severed neck to soak the thirsty wood. A roar erupted from the crowd, a wave of cheering and applause that crashed over Elias with physical force. Men clapped each other on the back, women nodded in approval, children hoisted on shoulders watched with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The executioner wiped his blade on a piece of cloth, his face as expressionless as if he had just cut a loaf of bread. The efficiency of it, the sheer, practiced precision, was more horrifying than any display of rage could have been. This was not a crime of passion. It was a bureaucratic function, death administered by the state with chilling dispassion. A sour taste flooded Ilyas's mouth. The world tilted, the cheers becoming a distant, buzzing hum. The vibrant colors of the crowd blurred into a nauseating swirl. He stumbled back, shoving his way through the jubilant masses, his hand clamped over his mouth. He barely made it to a shadowed alley before his stomach convulsed, emptying its contents onto the cobblestones in a series of ragged, painful heaves. He leaned against a cold stone wall, trembling, the image of the falling blade and the spurting blood seared onto the back of his eyelids. Dmitri found him there moments later, his expression not one of pity, but of weary understanding. He offered a waterskin, which Elias accepted with a shaking hand, rinsing the vile taste from his mouth. "They steal, they lose their heads," Dmitri said, his voice flat. "It is the law. It is always the same. The people, they cheer because it reminds them of the price. It keeps the streets safe. It is routine." The word, spoken so casually, landed on Elias with more force than the executioner's blade. Routine. This grotesque spectacle, this severing of a life, was as ordinary as the market opening or the call to prayer. His scholarly detachment shattered completely, replaced by a cold, gripping unease. This was the justice Dmitri had hinted at on the docks. Not an abstract concept in a legal text, but a visceral, public reality. It was a system that valued order over empathy, finality over fairness. And, as Elias wiped his mouth, the metallic tang of his own fear mingling with the stench of vomit, he knew his journey into the heart of the empire had truly and terribly begun. The memory of the beheading clung to Elias like a shroud, its metallic scent seeming to permeate his clothes and the very pages of his journal. That night, sleep offered no refuge. In his dreams, the curved scimitar did not fall, but remained suspended, a perpetual threat over a faceless crowd that wore Dmitri's knowing smile. He woke with a start, the first light of dawn painting his small room in pale, sickly hues, his heart still racing from the phantom echo of the crowd's cheer, seeking distraction, or perhaps a perverse form of confirmation. He found Dmitri already waiting for him at a quiet cafe nestled in a shadowed courtyard, sipping a tiny cup of thick, bitter coffee. Elias's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his own cup, the dark liquid within seeming to mirror the turmoil in his soul. He spoke of his nightmare, of the relentless image of the blade. Dmitri listened, his gaze distant, fixed on a point somewhere beyond the courtyard walls, in the direction of the sprawling hills that cradled the city. "Ahead is a clean thing," Dmitri said, his voice low and devoid of its usual pragmatic tone. It was a voice for secrets and for horrors. "It is quick. A moment of terror, then nothing. There are other sentences that are not so clean. Sentences that are not meant to merely kill, but to speak." He fell silent for a long moment, and Elias felt a cold dread coil in his stomach, a sense that he was about to step from a nightmare into a deeper, more profound darkness. Dmitri's eyes, when they finally met his, were haunted. 3 days ago, in the fields beyond the Edorn Gate, they impaled a rebel, he began, and the word itself seemed to suck the warmth from the air. A Bulgarian, they said, who had raised a hand against a tax collector. His punishment was to be a lesson, a whisper on the wind that would travel farther than any official decree. Dmitri described the scene, not with graphic relish, but with a chilling, meticulous detail that etched itself into Elias's mind with the clarity of a master engraving. The tall, sharpened stake, its wood fresh and pale, planted firmly in the earth. The man, stripped of his dignity and his clothes, his body pale and vulnerable in the harsh sunlight. The executioners, their methods honed by a terrible, ancient science, working not with rage but with a gruesome practicality. He spoke of the careful, agonizing placement of the stake, designed to avoid immediate vital organs, to prolong the suffering for hours, sometimes days. He described the body's own weight as the primary instrument of torture, a slow, inexorable descent, as gravity did its gruesome work. The most haunting detail, the one that would forever poison Elias's dreams, was Dmitri's description of the silence that fell after the initial scream. Not the silence of death, but the silence of an ongoing, unimaginable agony. The victim, suspended between earth and sky, could do nothing but endure. The stake, Dmitri whispered, pressing a fist to his own sternum, would sometimes press upwards against the diaphragm, forcing the air from the lungs in a final, rasping whisper, a sound that was not a scream, but a sigh. A last, terrible secret told only to the crows and the empty sky. Elias pushed his coffee away, his appetite gone, replaced by a nausea that was deeper and more profound than what had gripped him in the square. This was not the swift, public finality of the blade. This was a calculated theatre of prolonged suffering, a spectacle designed not just to punish one man, but to terrify 1,000 others into absolute submission. It was state power rendered in flesh and splintered wood, a message written in agony. A new, more personal fear began to gnaw at him, cold and insidious. He was a foreigner, a scholar, prying into the Empire's most brutal mechanisms. He was asking questions, taking notes. Where was the line between academic curiosity and sedition in the eyes of a state that employed the stake? If a man could be impaled for raising a hand to a tax collector, what fate awaited a foreigner who sought to document and critique the very foundations of its justice? His own body felt fragile suddenly, his skin a thin and inadequate barrier against the world Dmitri described. The city outside the café, once a marvel of human achievement, now felt like a beautiful, intricate cage. Its gilded bars tipped with a poison that worked slowly, that whispered of a fate worse than any clean, quick death. The stench hit Elias first, a physical presence that seemed to slither from the narrow, unmarked archway set deep in the foundation of a towering government building. It was a thick, cloying miasma of mildew, unwashed flesh, and the coppery temps of old blood, a smell that spoke of despair trapped in stone. Dmitri had secured the visit through a series of hushed conversations and the discreet passage of silver coins. Their gleam a stark contrast to the grimy palm of the guard, who finally nodded, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. This was not a place on any map for tourists. This was where the Empire hid its failures and its forgotten. A secret world of suffering beneath the bustling city. The guard, a hulking silhouette against the weak torchlight, led them down a steep, winding staircase. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, the sounds of the city above fading into a distant, impossible memory. The walls wept a viscous dampness, and the only sounds were the scuttling of unseen things in the darkness and the rhythmic drip of water. Then another sound emerged, a low, collective moan that seemed to emanate from the very stones, a chorus of human misery. They emerged into a vast, cavernous space, the dungeon proper. The torchlight, a feeble challenger to the oppressive gloom, danced over a nightmare scene. Iron bars divided the space into a dozen cramped cages, each one a pit of squalor. Inside, figures moved like ghosts, their bodies so emaciated they were little more than skeletons draped in parchment-thin skin. Their eyes, when they caught the light, were hollow pits, all hope long since extinguished. Some lay motionless in the filth that coated the floor, while others rocked slowly back and forth, their minds having retreated to some internal sanctuary to escape the unrelenting horror of their reality. Ilias's stomach clenched, his scholarly composure dissolving into a wave of visceral pity and revulsion. This was not the swift, public terror of the executioner's block or the grim spectacle of the stake. This was a slower, more insidious form of destruction, a grinding down of the human spirit through neglect, starvation, and perpetual darkness. It was dehumanization made manifest. His gaze was drawn to a corner of the chamber where a different sort of activity was taking place. A prisoner was held down on a rough wooden bench, his ankles clamped in a heavy, hinged stocks. Another guard stood over him, holding a long, flexible rod. As Elias watched, frozen, the rod rose and fell with a sickening, rhythmic thwack against the bare soles of the man's feet. The victim made no scream, only a choked, guttural gasp with each impact, his body jerking against the restraints. Dmitri leaned close, his whisper barely audible. "Bastinado," he murmured, the whip to the feet. "It leaves no lasting marks a master would see on a slave's back, but the pain. It is exquisite. It can cripple a man without breaking his skin for labor. The guard with the rod finished his work, unclamping the stocks. The prisoner slumped to the floor, unable to stand, his whole body trembling as he cradled his swollen, bruised feet. The casual brutality of it, the administrative nature of the torture, struck Elias with a force that left him breathless. Driven by a compulsion he did not fully understand, Elias approached one of the cages. A man was sitting near the bars, slightly apart from the others. He was older, his beard matted and grey, but his eyes, though sunken, held a faint, stubborn ember of intelligence. He looked at Elias, not with the vacant stare of the others, but with a sharp, assessing gaze. Elias crouched, the foulness of the floor seeping through his breeches. He did not speak, could not have found the words, but the prisoner seemed to understand the unspoken question. His voice, when it came, was a dry rasp, like stones grinding together. He told a simple, devastating story. He had been a scribe, a keeper of records. A high-ranking official had been embezzling funds and had needed a scapegoat. The false evidence was easily planted, the accusation made. There was no trial, only a swift pronouncement of guilt and a descent into this subterranean hell. His family believed him dead. His name was erased. He was now just a number, a body taking up space until it stopped functioning. The man's quiet, factual tone was more powerful than any outburst of rage could have been. It laid bare the utter fragility of innocence in a system where power was truth. Elias felt a hot, righteous anger begin to burn away his fear and disgust. This was not justice. It was a perversion, a machinery of oppression that fed on the powerless. The man's story was not an anomaly, he realized, looking around the cavern. It was the story of every soul trapped in this darkness, their humanity systematically stripped away, not by a single act of violence, but by the slow, crushing weight of an indifferent empire. The dungeon's shadows seemed to seep into his own soul, carrying with them the chilling truth that the most terrifying punishment was not death, but the eradication of a person, piece by piece, in the dark, where no one was watching. The rhythmic crack of the lash was a sound that did not so much cut through the morning air as stitch itself into the fabric of the day. A brutal metronome marking time in the market square. Elias stood at the periphery of the gathered crowd, his body rigid. His fingers curled so tightly into his palms that his nails bit into the skin. The spectacle before him was both less dramatic and more intimate than the beheading, a slower, more methodical unraveling of a human being. A young man, his tunic stripped from his back, was bound by his wrists to a wooden post, his skin pale and vulnerable against the weathered timber. His crime, Dmitri had murmured moments before, was the theft of a loaf of bread and a wedge of cheese. The executioner was not a hulking brute, but a man of average build, his movements economical and practiced. He held a multi-tailed whip, the ends tipped with small, cruel barbs. With each swing of his arm, the cords whistled through the air before landing with a wet, tearing sound on the man's back. The crowd watched, not with the roaring bloodlust of the beheading, but with a quiet, almost bored acceptance. This was a common punishment, a regular maintenance of the social order, as routine as the sweeping of the streets. Elias forced himself to watch, his scholar's mind battling his churning stomach. He documented the details with a cold, internal voice, the way the skin split open on the fifth strike, the way thin rivulets of blood began to trace paths down the man's spine and soak into the waistband of his trousers. By the 20th lash, the man's back was a grotesque canvas of shredded flesh, a raw, pulpy mess of crimson and white. The initial, sharp cries of pain had subsided into low, animalistic grunts. With each impact, his body jerking against its bonds in a useless, reflexive struggle. The humiliation was as potent as the pain. He was being broken not in the privacy of a dungeon, but in the full light of the sun, before the indifferent eyes of his fellow citizens. When it was finally over, the executioner simply stepped back, coiling his bloody whip. The man was cut down, collapsing into a heap at the foot of the post, his body a shuddering wreck. 2 guards dragged him away by his arms, his limp feet leaving twin smears of blood on the dusty stones. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming as if a minor interruption had concluded. Elias turned to Dmitri, his face a mask of pale disgust. "For bread and cheese," he breathed, his voice tight. That was not discipline. That was cruelty. To flay a man alive for a moment of hunger. Dmitri's expression remained impassive, his gaze following the trail of blood. "You see cruelty, Elias. The Empire sees order. A loaf today, a purse tomorrow, a rebellion next year. The lash teaches a lesson that the stomach does not forget. It is a small price to pay for safe streets. Without such demonstrations, chaos would bloom." "Chaos?" Elias shot back, the image of the man's ravaged back burning behind his eyes. "You call this order? This is the creation of terror, not the preservation of peace. It dehumanizes the punished and hardens the hearts of those who watch." Dmitri finally looked at him, a flicker of impatience in his weary eyes. "Your soft French heart judges what it does not understand. This is not Paris. Here power must be visible, its consequences undeniable. Mercy is seen as weakness, and weakness is an invitation to anarchy. The man will live, and he will never steal again. The crowd has seen the cost. That is the function of the lash. It is not pretty, but it is effective." The argument hung between them, a chasm of culture and conscience that could not be bridged. Elias saw a broken body and a shattered spirit. Dmitri saw a necessary calculation, a transaction of pain for stability. As they walked away from the square, the coppery scent of blood seeming to follow them, Elias felt a profound shift within himself. The horror was no longer just a paralyzing sickness. It was crystallizing into a cold, hard resolve. Dmitri's pragmatic justifications, the crowd's passive acceptance, these were parts of the same terrible machine that required the shredded backs and the severed heads to function. His initial dread was now fused with a fierce, defiant purpose. He would document it all. He would bear witness to the lash, the blade, and the stake. He would capture the stark reality of this so-called order, not as a distant scholar, but as a chronicler of its true, brutal cost. The disgust curdling in his gut was no longer a weakness. It was the ink with which he would write the truth. The Bosphorus was a ribbon of liquid mercury under the afternoon sun, a breathtaking seam of shimmering blue that stitched the continents of Europe and Asia together. From the hill where Elias stood with an elderly Greek woman named Eleni, the scene was one of serene majesty. Majestic kayaks with billowing white sails glided across the water, and the distant calls of fishermen echoed like mournful songs. But Eleni's voice, a dry rustle of leaves, wove a different story into the salt-tinged air, a story that poisoned the beautiful vista, turning the sparkling waters into a vast, silent cemetery. She spoke not of the glory of the strait, but of its hidden, suffocating darkness. Her words were for the women, she explained, her gnarled fingers tracing the wool of her shawl. For a man accused of adultery, the law might demand a fine, a flogging, or imprisonment. But for a woman, the sentence was often far more final, far more silent. She described the punishment with a chilling matter-of-factness that made Elias's blood run cold. The condemned woman would be stripped of her fine clothes, her dignity, and her identity. Then, She would be forced into a coarse, heavy sack, its rough weave a final shroud. Sometimes a cat or a snake would be thrust in with her, a last, frantic companion in terror. The sack would be tied shut, its knot a seal on a life. Then, under the cover of night or in the grey light of dawn, men would row a small boat to the deepest, swiftest part of the current. With a heave that required no ceremony, the squirming, muffled burden would be consigned to the water. Elias stared at the serene surface of the Bosphorus, his mind's eye piercing the glittering facade to the cold, dark depths below. He imagined the plunge, the shocking embrace of the water, the desperate, frantic struggle inside the sack. The air would become a precious, dwindling commodity, each breath tasting of damp wool and terror. The water would seep in, cold and relentless, soaking the clothes, weighing the body down. There would be no final scream, no last words carried on the wind, only the silent, internal scream of lungs burning for air that would not come, the threshing limbs tangling in the rough cloth, the final, agonizing inhalation of salt water. It was a death of utter isolation, a private horror played out in a public space, witnessed only by the indifferent fish and the impassive current. The sheer, intimate cruelty of it eclipsed the public brutalities he had witnessed. The beheading was a spectacle of power, the impalement a grim lesson, the lash a public correction. But this was an erasure. It was a punishment designed not just to kill, but to humiliate, to dispose of a problem with a neat, quiet finality that left no blood on the stones, no body to mourn. It spoke of a deep, systemic bias that viewed a woman's transgression as a pollution that required complete annihilation, while a man's might be met with a transactional penalty. The silent suffering of women, Eleni implied, was woven into the very fabric of the law, a submerged horror beneath the empire's majestic surface. Driven by a grim compulsion, Elias descended the hill and made his way to the water's edge. The beauty of the place now felt like a lie. The lapping of the waves against the stone quay was no longer a soothing rhythm but a whisper of countless secrets, a liquid murmur of stolen breaths and extinguished lives. He watched a caique sail by, its wake a temporary scar on the water's skin, and imagined a heavier, smaller boat doing its grim work in the same spot. He saw not the vibrant life of the city, but the ghosts of women, their mouths open in soundless screams, their sightless eyes staring up through the murky green towards a sun they would never see again, their stories forever drowned, their graves unmarked and endless. The Bosphorus, in all its breathtaking splendor, had become a monument to a specific, gendered terror, a watery grave that held the empire's most silent and most damning verdicts. The path to the palace was a gilded labyrinth, a world away from the blood-soaked squares and the stinking dungeons. Elias followed Dmitri through courtyards where fountains whispered and peacocks fanned iridescent tails, their cries a stark contrast to the groans of the bastinado victim. They were granted an audience, not with a pasha or a vizier, but with a man who existed in the silent spaces between power, a living artifact of the empire's most intimate cruelties. He was introduced as Kyros, a chief eunuch of the inner court, a title that carried a quiet, formidable weight. He awaited them in a shaded loggia overlooking a garden of impossibly perfect roses, their scent cloying and heavy in the still air. Kyros was a man of indeterminate age, his face a hairless, placid mask that seemed carved from old ivory. His body, swathed in layers of fine silk, moved with a fluid, almost boneless grace. But his eyes held a depth of sorrow so profound it seemed to absorb the very light from the room. They were old eyes, ancient eyes, set in a face that had never known the rough touch of a beard. His voice, when he greeted them, was a high, mellifluous tenor, a permanent, living reminder of the price he had paid for his position. The conversation began with pleasantries about Ilias's studies, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Kira spoke of loyalty to the Sultan, not as a virtue, but as an absolute, unyielding force. A chain that bound one's fate as irrevocably as iron. To serve the shadow of God on earth requires a singular focus, he murmured, his gaze drifting to a pair of songbirds in a gilded cage. Earthly distractions, the passions of the flesh. They can cloud a man's judgment. They can lead to divided loyalties, to treason. The word hung in the perfumed air, and Elias felt a familiar chill. Kiraz's long, delicate fingers, absent-mindedly stroking a string of amber beads, stilled. He looked directly at Elias, and for the first time, the placid mask cracked, revealing a glimpse of the raw wound beneath. There are punishments for such failures of loyalty that are not recorded in the public decrees, Kira said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. They are private, a purification, a severing not just of the head or the limb, but of the very source of a man's potential for legacy and desire. It is a death that lets the body live on, a hollow vessel forever reminded of what was sacrificed. He did not need to say the word. The horror of it bloomed in Elias's mind, a silent, sickening understanding. Castration, it was a punishment that spoke of a specific, profound violation, an attack on the future itself. It was the ultimate price for treason, not just the end of a life, but the annihilation of a lineage, the silencing of a bloodline. Then Kiras shared his own story. It was not told for pity, but as a simple, devastating fact. He had not been born into this role. He had been a boy from a conquered village in the Caucasus, clever and comely, selected for his potential. His family had been paid a sum of money, a transaction for a son. The procedure, performed by a traveling specialist, was described not in graphic detail, but in terms of its aftermath. The fever dreams, the long, agonizing recovery, the fundamental, unalterable schism it created between his past and his present self. He had been remade, not into a man, but into a guardian of the harem, of secrets, and of his own perpetual loss. I am a living monument to the cost of loyalty, he said, his gaze returning to the caged birds. My body is the evidence of the Empire's absolute claim on those who serve it. I have gained proximity to power, a life of comfort, but I paid for it with my future. There is no wife, no son to carry my name. When I die, I will simply cease. There will be no echo. As their audience drew to a close, Kira's rose with that same fluid grace. He walked Elias to the arched doorway, the scent of roses clinging to his robes. Just before Elias stepped back into the sun-drenched courtyard, the eunuch placed a surprisingly strong, cool hand on his arm, halting him. He leaned close, his breath a whisper of spices and regret. You are a seeker of truths, Frenchman, Kiras murmured, his ancient eyes boring into Elias's. But some truths are like the scorpion that hides beneath the cool stone. To turn it over is to invite its sting. You walk in a garden of beautiful, dangerous flowers. Tread carefully. Do not peer too closely into the shadows between them. The secrets of this palace are guarded by more than just locked doors and silent vows. They are protected by a silence that can be imposed, a transformation that can be enforced. The warning landed not as a threat, but as a bleak, compassionate truth from a man who was its living embodiment. Elias stepped out of the shaded loggia, the sudden sunlight feeling harsh and invasive. He looked back once, but Kiras had already melted into the interior shadows, a guardian once more, a secret himself. The man's tragic past and his quiet, terrifying warning wove together, illustrating the ultimate cost of loyalty in this empire, not just the loss of life, but the loss of self, the eternal, silent price paid by those who guarded its most terrible and intimate powers. The key to the archive was not a key at all, but a whispered name. A sliver of information passed from the eunuch's world of shadows to Dimitri's network of whispers. It gained them entry not through a grand, guarded portal, but through a forgotten postern gate, a seam in the imperial stonework hidden behind a cascading curtain of wisteria. The scent of the flowers, sweet and cloying, was a stark prelude to the dry, ancient odor of decay that awaited them inside. The air in the corridor was still and cold, thick with the dust of centuries and the ghosts of unread stories. Torchlight pushed back the darkness, revealing walls lined not with gold or mosaic, but with endless shelves of bound ledgers and rolled vellum, a catacomb of bureaucratic memory. This was the heart of the matter, Elias realized with a thrill that was equal parts scholarly excitement and visceral dread. This was where the empire recorded its own deeds, not for the public's eyes, but for its own eternal memory. The public beheadings and floggings were the theater. This silent, dusty chamber was the script. Dimitri stood watch at the entrance, a silhouette against the faint purple light from outside, his presence a taut wire of tension. Elias was alone with the truth. He moved down the narrow aisles, his fingers trailing over the leather spines. The ledgers were organized by year, by district, by type of transgression. He pulled one at random, its cover sending up a plume of dust that danced in the torchlight. The script within was a precise, elegant Ottoman Turkish, a beautiful hand recording ugly things. He saw lists of names, each one followed by a terse, devastating summary: theft of livestock, right hand severed, sedition, tongue removed. The entries were devoid of emotion, as clinical as a physician's notes. Human lives were reduced to a crime and a consequence, filed away and forgotten. Then he found the section he had been unconsciously seeking, a shelf marked with a symbol he did not recognize but whose meaning he could intuit. These ledgers were heavier, their pages thicker. He opened one, and the descriptions within made his blood run cold. This was not the public justice of the blade or the lash. This was the empire's private, brutal soul laid bare. He read of men boiled alive in great copper vats for treason, their screams swallowed by the searing water. He found accounts of dismemberment, of limbs being systematically torn from their sockets by teams of horses for the crime of rebellion, the body scattered to the four winds as a final, symbolic eradication. The beautiful, flowing script described the popping of joints, the specific angles of cuts, the duration of screams. It was a taxonomy of agony, a science of suffering. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the profound silence. He was about to close the ledger, his stomach churning, when a loose sheet of vellum, tucked between the pages like a secret, fluttered to the floor. He crouched, retrieving it. The script on this page was different, hurried, less formal, and in some places deliberately smudged. It detailed the case of a provincial governor, a man of high rank and immense wealth, accused of embezzling vast sums from the imperial treasury. The evidence was overwhelming. The crime, a direct theft from the Sultan himself. The prescribed punishment for such an act was explicit and horrifying. Yet, the record showed no execution, no brutal, exemplary end. Instead, there was a single, final, cryptic entry, reassigned to oversight of grain stores in a distant province. Case sealed by order of the Grand Vizier. Elias stared at the words, the implications crashing over him. A corrupt official, caught stealing from the empire's heart, had not been boiled or torn apart. He had been quietly shuffled away, his crime buried in this forgotten archive under a layer of dust and bureaucratic obfuscation. The law, so absolute and merciless for the thief of bread, was malleable, negotiable for the powerful. The scales of justice, which he had seen weighted so heavily with iron and blood, could be tipped with gold and influence. A surge of purpose, hot and clear, burned through the lingering dread in his veins. This was the truth that needed to be exposed. Not just the public brutality, which was terrifying enough, but this hidden corruption, this tutored system where the powerful played by a different set of rules. The unseen records were not just a log of punishments. They were a map of the empire's hypocrisy. He carefully folded the vellum sheet and slipped it inside his tunic, against his skin. It was no longer just a document, it was evidence. It was a promise. The fear he had carried since witnessing the beheading was now eclipsed by a newfound resolve. He would expose it, or the blade, the lash, the stake, and the silent, covered-up crimes of the powerful. The archive had given him its darkest secret, and in doing so, it had given him his mission. The scent of the archivist's old vellum and secret still clung to Ilias's clothes as he stepped back into the vibrant, sun-drenched chaos of the city. The folded vellum, hidden against his chest, felt less like paper and more like a live coal. Burning with the heat of his newfound purpose, he moved through the crowded streets with a scholar's focus, his mind racing, assembling the pieces of the brutal tapestry he had witnessed. The blade, the lash, the stake, the watery gravel were threads woven into a pattern of absolute power. But the covered-up corruption of the provincial governor was the frayed edge, the flaw in the weave that revealed the whole cloth to be a lie. He needed to find Dmitri, to share this damning evidence, and plan their next move. He did not have to search for long. As he turned a corner into a quieter lane, shadowed by overhanging balconies, a figure detached itself from a recessed doorway. It was not Dmitri. The man was tall and lean, dressed in the immaculate, dark robes of a mid-level Ottoman official. His beard was precisely trimmed, his posture erect, and his eyes held the flat, assessing gaze of a man accustomed to obedience. He did not block Elias's path, but his presence became an immovable object in the narrow street, forcing Elias to halt. The French scholar, the official, said. His Greek was flawless, but his tone was cold, devoid of the musicality Elias had come to associate with the language. It was the voice of the state, stripped of all humanity. You have been a busy guest in our city. Your curiosity has taken you to many instructive places. Elias's heart seemed to freeze in his chest. The coal of the hidden vellum now felt like a brand. He said nothing, his mind frantically scanning the faces in the square, searching for Dmitri's familiar, watchful presence, but finding only strangers. The official took a slow step forward, his hands clasped behind his back. The public squares, the dungeons, the archives. You have a taste for the grim mechanics of empire. It is an unwise appetite for a foreigner. He paused, letting the silence stretch, a deliberate tool of intimidation. The hospitality of the Sultan is vast, but it is not infinite. There are rooms in our guest quarters that are less comfortable than others. Rooms with bars on the windows and locks on the outside. A man can be a guest for a very long time in such a room, forgotten by the world outside, his curiosity finally satisfied. The threat was not shouted. It was laid out with the same chilling precision as the executioner's blade. It was an offer of imprisonment, of disappearance. Elias imagined the dungeon he had visited, the emaciated prisoners, the hollow eyes. He felt the ghost of that stench in his nostrils. The official's gaze seemed to penetrate his tunic, to see the folded secret burning against his skin. For a long, suspended moment, the only thing Elias could feel was the primal urge for flight. It screamed through his veins, a desperate, animal instinct to abandon his notes, his mission, to run for the docks and beg passage on the first ship heading west. He could return to Paris, to the safety of academic debates and theoretical justice. He could live. Self-preservation painted a vivid, tempting picture of a future far from this city of silent screams and official threats. But then another image surfaced, rising to meet the fear. The scribe in the dungeon, his quiet voice recounting his erased life, the raw, shredded back of the bread thief, the silent, suffocating horror of the sack in the Bosphorus. To flee now would be to abandon them all to the silence. It would be to validate the very system that crushed them, to become another bystander in the crowd who turned away. His integrity, the core of his purpose for being here, felt like the only solid ground in a world of shifting, terrifying sands. The official watched the internal struggle play out on Elias's face. A faint, cold smile touched his lips, as if he had seen this same conflict 100 times before, and knew how it usually ended. "A wise man knows when his studies are complete," he said softly. "The ship *Sea Nymph* departs for Marseille at dawn. I would consider it a personal recommendation." He did not wait for a reply. With a final, dismissive glance, he turned and walked away, his dark robes blending into the shifting patterns of the crowd until he was gone, leaving only the echo of his warning hanging in the air. Elias stood rooted to the spot, his body trembling with the aftershock of the confrontation. The tension between self-preservation and integrity was a physical ache in his chest. To stay was to risk everything: his freedom, his life. To leave was to sacrifice the truth, to become complicit through his silence. He looked down the lane, toward the distant glint of the sea and the promise of escape. Then he looked in the direction of the city's dark, secret heart, where the covered-up truth of the corrupt official lay buried. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of spices and the sea filling his lungs. He would not take the official's recommendation. He would not board the *Sea Nymph*. The risk was immense, a precipice yawning before him, but he had come too far to turn back now. There was one more investigation to make, one final thread to pull. He needed to find Dmitri. He needed to learn what other secrets this city was hiding before the door of his prison cell slammed shut forever. The warning had been given, and he had chosen to ignore it. Now, he would race against the closing darkness. The silence in the small, hidden room above the spice merchant's shop was more oppressive than any dungeon's gloom. Dmitri had led Elias there by a circuitous route, his movements sharp with a new, furtive urgency. The air was thick with the scent of cumin and dried rose petals, a fragrant shroud over the grim secret about to be unveiled. Dmitri's face, usually a mask of weary pragmatism, was pale, his eyes darting towards the single shuttered window as if expecting the shadows outside to congeal into armed guards at any moment. The official's warning was a fresh brand on both their minds. A ticking clock whose hands were sweeping toward a terrible, final hour. Dmitri did not speak at first. He poured 2 cups of a harsh, clear liquor, his hand trembling slightly, a sight Elias had never witnessed before. He drained his own cup in one swift motion, the liquid seeming to fortify him against the horror he was about to recount. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, gravelly whisper, stripped of all its former casualness. "You have seen the public deaths," he began, his gaze fixed on the rough wood of the table between them. "The blade, the stake, they are warnings meant to be seen. But the Empire has another punishment, one reserved for those who challenge its very foundation. For political dissidents, for thinkers and writers who plant seeds of rebellion in the minds of men. It is a punishment designed not for spectacle, but for erasure. It is called the Silent Earth. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The name itself was a void, an absence of sound and light. Dmitri leaned forward, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. He described a practice so secret, so abhorrent, it was never written in any ledger, never spoken of in the coffee houses. Dissidents, those deemed too dangerous for a public execution that might martyr them, were taken not to a square or a field, but to a forgotten corner of one of the vast imperial cemeteries. There, under the cover of a moonless night, a narrow, deep pit would be dug. The condemned, often a scholar or a disgraced minor official who had voiced the wrong sentiment, would be forced into the hole. They would be standing, entombed vertically in the cold, damp earth. Then the soil would be shoveled back in, not to the neck as in some barbaric traditions, but completely up to the chin, leaving only the head exposed above the ground. "They are buried alive," Dmitri whispered, the words hanging in the spice-laden air like a poison. "They are left there, a head on the surface of the world, the rest of the body encased in an earthen coffin. There is no water, no food. The sun bakes their face by day. The cold numbs it by night. They cannot move, cannot scratch an itch, cannot shift to relieve the agonizing pressure on their limbs. They are at the mercy of insects, of scavenging birds." His voice trailed off, the image too ghastly to complete. The true horror, he explained, was not just the slow, agonizing death from exposure and thirst. It was the psychological torment, the utter, absolute helplessness. A person could last for days in that state, a living monument to their own dying, their mind unraveling in the silence, their final, rasping breaths witnessed only by the indifferent stars and the silent, waiting graves around them. It was the ultimate silencing, a fate that left no body to recover, no grave to mourn. The person simply vanished, and the silent earth kept its secret. Elias sat back, the room swimming round him. This surpassed every cruelty he had documented. The stake was a horror of prolonged pain, but this was a horror of prolonged futility. It was a death of absolute solitude and impotent rage, a calculated, psychological dismantling of a human being. The empire wasn't just killing its enemies, it was unmaking them, erasing them from existence with a method so quiet, so insidious, it was as if they had never been. The folded vellum in his tunic now felt like a death warrant. He had evidence of corruption, and now he knew the fate that potentially awaited those who threatened the powerful. Time was no longer a commodity. It was a noose tightening. He could not wait, could not deliberate further. He had to act. As Dmitri kept watch, Elias spread out his notes and the damning vellum. His movements were swift, precise. The scholar now fully transformed into a conspirator. He made additional copies of the most critical information, his script a frantic scrawl. He separated the documents, deciding which to keep on his person and which to hide in separate, prearranged locations: a gap in a particular wall near the docks, a loose floorboard in his rented room. He could not risk carrying it all, nor could he risk it all being found in one place. Simultaneously, his mind, sharpened by fear, began to chart an escape route. He mentally mapped the warren of narrow streets between the merchant's shop and the harbor, identifying choke points and alternative pathways. He recalled a particular wine cellar with a back exit that led to a different district, a mosque whose busy courtyard could provide cover, a disused aqueduct that offered a hidden path along the city's edge. He would need a boat, not a grand ship, but a small, fast caïque with a captain whose loyalty could be purchased with the last of his silver, and the promise of more from the French consulate in the next port. The stakes were no longer about documenting injustice. They were about surviving it. The hidden truth of the silent earth had made one thing terrifyingly clear. If he was caught, his story would end not with a bang or a whimper, but with the slow, silent crush of dirt and the desperate, soundless scream of a man being swallowed by the earth. The scent of roasting chestnuts and the distant call to prayer usually painted Constantinople in a veil of normalcy, but for Elias every sound was a potential alarm. Every glance from a stranger a threat. The hidden truth of the silent earth had transformed the city from a subject of study into a hunting ground. And he was the prey. Dmitri's final, desperate piece of information had led them here. To a nondescript warehouse nestled in the maze of streets behind the spice market, a place where the air itself tasted of fear and old pain. It was said a minor pasha, a man with a reputation for brutal efficiency, was using a forgotten sub-basement to extract confessions through methods so heinous they were forbidden even by the vampire's own grim standards. They found a cracked window at the back of the building, its wood rotten from neglect. The space within was not a dungeon in the traditional sense, but a cold, stone-lined cellar, lit by a single, guttering torch that threw frantic, dancing shadows, and in those shadows Elias saw the truth that would haunt him until his dying day. The pasha, a man with a carefully groomed beard and rings on his fingers, stood observing as two burly guards worked on a prisoner strapped to a wooden frame. The man was naked, his body a road map of old scars and fresh welts. But it was the device being used that froze the blood in Elias's veins. A brazier glowed with hot coals, and nestled within them were metal rods, their tips beginning to glow a faint, hellish orange. They were not using the bastonado or the lash. They were preparing to brand, to sear, to inflict pain with a precision designed to break the mind rather than just the body. Ilias's stomach roiled, his scholarly detachment incinerated by a wave of pure, unadulterated horror. This was not state-sanctioned punishment. This was sadism, masquerading as justice, a secret corruption that festered in the empire's underbelly. He had to bear witness, to add this final, damning chapter to his chronicle. But, in his revulsion, he shifted his weight, and the rotten window-sill beneath his hand gave way with a sharp, splintering crack. The sound was a gunshot in the tense silence. The pasha's head snapped up, his eyes, cold and intelligent, locking directly onto Ilyas's in the window. There was no shout, no cry of alarm, only a swift, pointed finger and a single hissed command to his guards. The hunt was on. Elias stumbled back, shoving Dmitri. "Run!" The word was a ragged gasp. They fled into the narrow, shadowed alley, the pounding of heavy boots echoing behind them, growing rapidly closer. The labyrinthine streets, once a source of fascination, became a terrifying trap. They twisted and turned, their breath tearing from their lungs, the world narrowing to the next corner, the next potential hiding place. A market stall overturned behind them, sending a cascade of pottery shattering across the cobblestones, a momentary, chaotic barrier. They ducked under a low archway, pressed themselves into a recessed doorway still warm from the day's sun. The smell of urine and baking bread a bizarre counterpoint to the terror. He could hear the guards shouting to one another, their voices triangulating, closing in. The price of his truth-seeking was no longer an abstract concept. It was the burning in his legs, the frantic hammering of his heart, the very real prospect of feeling those hot metal rods on his own skin, or worse, being consigned to the silent earth. A hand grabbed his cloak from behind, yanking him off balance. He spun, lashing out blindly, his fist connecting with something hard. There was a grunt of pain, and the grip loosened. He didn't look back, just ran, Dmitri a half-step ahead, pulling him into an even narrower passage, so tight the walls scraped against his shoulders. They burst out onto a wider street, the sudden space a dizzying shock. A cart loaded with hay was passing, and without a word, they dove into its prickly, concealing depths, burrowing deep as the driver cursed and the cart continued its slow, plodding journey. They lay there, trembling, listening as the guards' footsteps pounded past, their angry shouts fading into the general din of the city. The immediate danger had passed, but the realization that settled over Elias in the dusty, sweet-smelling darkness was more chilling than any capture. He had seen the true face of the danger now. It was not just the law, not just the system, but the men who wielded its power in the shadows, men for whom cruelty was a tool and a pleasure. He had escaped with his life and his notes, but he knew, with a certainty that seeped into his bones, that he had peered too deep into the abyss, and its gaze was now irrevocably fixed upon him. The deck of the French merchant vessel Aurori was a world of salt-stained wood and straining canvas, a fragile island of order upon the chaotic, wind-dark sea. As Constantinople receded into a smudge of gold and shadow on the horizon, Elias stood at the stern rail, his knuckles white where they gripped the wood. The city that had been his obsession, his classroom, and his nightmare was now a silhouette against the rising sun, its minarets like spears holding up the bleeding sky. He did not feel triumph, only a hollowed-out exhaustion, as if the horrors he had witnessed had scooped out his insides and left a cavern echoing with silent screams. He turned from the rail, the city's spectral presence a weight on his soul. In the relative privacy of his cramped berth below decks, he lit a single, guttering candle. The flame danced, throwing long, leaping shadows that reminded him of the torch in the Pasha's secret cellar. He unstrapped his leather satchel, its surface scarred and stained from his frantic flight. With reverent care, he laid out his tools, a pot of ink, a handful of quills, and the sheaf of papers that constituted his life's most vital work. There were his own meticulous notes, written in his precise French hand, detailing the public spectacles of the blade and the lash. There were the transcripts of Dmitri's grim stories, the whispers of the stake and the watery grave. And there, folded and creased, was the damning vellum from the archive, the evidence of corruption that had nearly cost him his life. He dipped his quill, the nib scraping against the bottom of the pot. The first drop of ink on the fresh page bloomed like a dark star, a point of genesis from which all the pain would now flow. He began to write, not as a dispassionate scholar, but as a witness. The words came not from his mind alone, but from his gut, from the memory of the coppery scent of blood in the square, the phantom taste of bile in his throat, the chilling whisper of Kiros's warning, and the suffocating terror of the chase. He wrote of the emaciated scribe in the dungeon, entrusting him with the story of his erased life. He wrote of the young thief's shredded back, a testament to a justice that valued order over mercy. He described the imagined, suffocating plunge into the Bosphorus, giving voice to the silent suffering of women. He chronicled the hidden truth of the silent earth, ensuring that those erased by the state would have a memorial, however small, in his pages. His hand cramped, the candle burned low, and still he wrote. He was building a fortress of words against the tide of forgetting, a citadel of memory to stand against the empire's power to silence and erase. This documentation was no longer just an academic exercise. It was an act of defiance, a quiet rebellion waged with ink and parchment. In the rhythmic scratch of his quill, he found a strange, somber peace, The inner conflict that had torn at him, the clash between his empathy and his scholarly duty, between his terror and his integrity, finally stilled. The fear was not gone, but it had been transmuted into purpose. His own safety, his comfort, even his life, were secondary to the imperative of this record. This journal would be his testimony, his echo in the halls of history, ensuring that the atrocities he witnessed would not be swallowed by the silence of the grave or the indifference of time. As dawn broke, painting the sea in shades of rose and gold, Elias laid down his quill. The final page was filled. He closed the journal, its pages now heavy with the weight of countless stories of suffering and injustice. He bound it tightly with a leather cord, sealing it with a drop of wax. The city was gone from sight, but it lived on, vivid and terrible, within the confines of this book. He had escaped with his life, but he carried the city's darkness with him, a sacred, terrible burden. Leaning back against the ship's timbers, he listened to the creak of the rigging and the sigh of the waves, sounds of a world moving on. But he knew his journey was not over. He was now a keeper of echoes, and his duty was to ensure they were heard.